Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Right Hon George Osborne MP, has agreed to address the conference today on the subject of EU growth and competitiveness in the 21st century. Following his speech, there'll be the opportunity to ask a few questions, and that section will be moderated by Mats Persson, the Director of Open Europe, who is also the co-host of the conference today. So it is my great pleasure to introduce the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne.
Thank you very much, Clayton. Well, Andrea, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me here today, and congratulations to Fresh Start and to Open Europe for pulling together this truly excellent conference of European reformers. And as Andrea's excellent opening speech reminded us, she and the Fresh Start team are providing just the kind of practical and challenging thinking we need as we work towards a reformed Europe. Likewise, Mats and Open Europe are influencing the debate, not just here in the UK, but right across Europe. And I know that your new partner office in Berlin is already having an important impact on the debate there. And I also want to pay a particular tribute to Rodney Leach, sitting there in the front row. Rodney's tireless campaigning helped keep Britain out of the euro. I'm proud to have been on the board of that No campaign, and it is hard to imagine now, but at the time joining the euro seemed a real possibility. And I shudder to think what would have happened during the last decade if we had joined the single currency. We would have had an even more extreme boom and bust cycle and a downturn even deeper than the Great Recession we experienced under the previous government. And in the aftermath, as we tried to pick up the pieces, we would have been hobbled without a floating exchange rate or an independent monetary policy. And that wouldn't have been in the interests of this country, and I don't think it would have been in the interests of the rest of Europe either. The issues that were raised during the debate about joining the euro endure now. Arguments about the necessity of economic reform, concern that currency union would lead to further fiscal union, and doubts about the yawning democratic deficit. And at the time, William Hague, who I was working for then, predicted that the euro could become a burning building with no exits. And more than a decade later, these issues have not gone away. Far from it. They have been thrown into sharp focus by the economic crisis in Europe and in the Eurozone. And that's why, a year ago, the Prime Minister gave his landmark speech on the need for a reformed Europe fit for the global race and a reformed relationship between Britain and the European Union. It's why he committed our country to a referendum on that renegotiation. In Britain, it's always felt like there have been two debates about the European Union. One debate is about sovereignty, democracy, and accountability. And a second debate has been about the economics. But there aren't two debates. There is one debate. And getting the economics right is not sufficient to persuade people of the merits of the EU. Other constitutional change is needed. But getting the economics right is absolutely necessary to persuade people of the merits of the EU. It was, after all, sold to our country as a European economic community. And without economic success, the EU will not be regarded as democratically legitimate. You can see that in the way that support for the EU has fallen sharply right across the continent during the economic crisis. So today I want to develop the conversation about some of the economic reforms that we want to secure as part of the forthcoming negotiations. We need two things. First, we need economic reform that enables the EU to create jobs and economic security and compete in the global race, something it is not doing well at the moment. And second, as the Eurozone undertakes the integration required to make the euro work, we need constitutional reforms to make sure that those countries who are not in the euro can remain in the EU, confident that their interests and rights will be protected. Let me begin with the first of those things, with jobs and economic security. Now, we all knew there was a competitiveness problem in Europe before the crisis. But the crisis has dramatically accelerated the shifts in the tectonic economic plates that see power moving eastwards and southwards on our planet. Over the last 6 years, the European economy has stalled. In the same period, the Indian economy has grown by more than a third, the Chinese economy by nearly 70%. Over the next 15 years, Europe's share of global output is forecast to halve. Make no mistake, our continent is falling behind. Look at innovation, where Europe's share of world patent applications nearly halved in the last decade. Look at unemployment, where a quarter of young people looking for work can't find it. Look at welfare. As Angela Merkel has pointed out, Europe accounts for just over 7% of the world's population, 25% of its economy, and 50% of global social welfare spending. We can't go on like this. This is the continent that for centuries led the world in innovation and scientific discovery, enterprise and work ethic. Are we to say that the Europe that gave us Galileo and Darwin and Marie Curie, the Industrial Revolution, democracy and the free economy, the continent that gave us all of these things has just given up on the future because it's all too difficult? And as the father of 2 young children, I don't want to turn to them as we see the latest Chinese scientific breakthrough or Indian innovation and say, that used to be us, that used to be Europe. The hard truth is that if we want to maintain our way of life in Europe, we've got to get more competitive. And that's going to require some tough steps, living within our means, making our labour markets competitive, expanding free trade. Now, most of the action will have to be taken at a domestic level. And I'm not here to lecture other member states about that, not least because the UK has had to take more action than most. When I entered office 3.5 years ago, we had suffered one of the sharpest falls in national output, faced a higher budget deficit than almost any major Western economy, higher than Spain or Portugal, much higher than Italy or France. Indeed, our budget deficit has fallen a lot, but it is still one of the highest in Europe. So that's why we're working through a long-term economic plan that makes tough choices necessary for our long-term prosperity, reducing borrowing, cutting taxes, creating jobs by supporting business and investing in infrastructure, capping welfare and controlling immigration, delivering better skills and schools. And I know that we are not alone. Many of our neighbours have also taken tough decisions in recent years. We in Britain should praise them for it, not dismiss them. Germany led the way a decade ago with its employment and welfare reforms. Unemployment has halved since in Germany, remains half the European average. Spain is undertaking radical labour market reforms that are now yielding real results. Sweden has reformed its education and welfare systems. Now, it is right that most of these reforms have to be taken at the national level. We all have to put our own house in order. And there's still a huge amount more we all have to do, including here in Britain. But Europe's competitiveness also requires action at a European level. Now, there are those who throw their hands up and say, we can't reform Europe. It can't be done. It's all too hard. To them, I would say, we have already proved you wrong. Take the EU budget. Last year, the Prime Minister negotiated the first ever real terms cut to the EU budget. For the first time, EU spending is not going up, but coming down. And far from being a lone voice, we were working alongside like-minded countries like Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Denmark. Take bureaucracy. The UK, drawing on the findings of our business task force, has proposed a programme for cutting red tape in Europe that has secured the support of 13 other member states and the European Parliament. Take free trade. Britain was one of the strongest promoters of the recent trade deals with Canada, Singapore and Korea. The Canada deal alone will be worth £1.3 billion to Britain. Reducing the budget, tackling red tape, some of these free trade agreements, this is a good beginning, but it is not nearly enough. We should be much, much bolder. We should set ourselves the urgent task of completing the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the EU-US Free Trade Agreement. That would be the world's biggest ever trade deal. Together, our economies would account for half of global output. And the Commission estimate it would boost the European economy by 120 billion euros a year. That's over 500 euros for every family in the EU, and it would bring 10 billion pounds a year to the UK alone. Now, some in the European Parliament talk about stalling this transatlantic partnership to pursue other agendas. But when a quarter of young people looking for work in Europe are unemployed, this would be a complete betrayal. We need to create jobs, increase trade, support business growth. We've got the European tools to help with the job. Let's get on and use them. And the same applies, as Andrew was making clear, with the single market. We need to stop talking about completing the single market in services, in energy and digital, and get on and do it. I remember sitting around the ECOFIN table nearly 4 years ago and listening to Mario Monti present his report on the future of the single market. It offered a detailed plan for boosting the single market. On the services sector alone, it estimated we could boost GDP by up to 1.5%. And it was agreed by the EU. But 4 years on, what has come of that report? Precious little. And I think we now need to come up with innovative ideas to overcome the vested interests that are holding back progress in this area. Personally, I'm attracted to Open Europe's thoughts on using enhanced cooperation to allow a smaller group of member states to move forward towards trade liberalisation in areas like services among themselves, if not all EU member states can agree. And if enhanced cooperation can be used by others to create an expensive job-destroying thing like a financial transaction tax, why don't we think about using it for job-creating measures that others oppose? Now, if we in the EU are going to solve our competitiveness problems, we need to think big. And if we're going to create jobs and provide economic security, we need major reform. So the crisis has accelerated and sharpened the economic challenges that already face the whole of Europe. But the crisis has also brutally exposed the problems that were always apparent to many of us in this room in trying to run a currency union without a proper fiscal, financial and political union to back it up. This is the second area I want to talk about. The European Council President, Herman Van Rompuy, acknowledged this a few years ago, and he said this. He said, "This tension has been there since the single currency was created. However, the general public was not really made aware of it." Well, it wasn't for lack of trying in those debates about the euro 15 years ago. And everyone is aware of the tension now. 3 years ago, I gave an interview to the Financial Times, and I predicted that the economic crisis in the Eurozone would force the remorseless logic of monetary union towards greater fiscal and economic integration, including a banking union. And even as late as 2011, that was regarded as a controversial prediction. I also said that this loss of national control and the loss of economic flexibility was precisely why I didn't want the UK in the euro. Since then, the Eurozone has started to work through that remorseless logic, creating the banking union, the European Stability Mechanism to bail out Eurozone countries, and now the proposed single resolution mechanism to bail out Eurozone banks. And the UK has not blocked them. We could have blocked crucial parts of the banking union, but we didn't. And that's because we want the euro to work. Work for those in Europe who use it, work for us, because an unstable euro on our doorstep has already done great damage to jobs and growth in Britain. But we've been clear from the outset that in return for this integration, non-euro members like the UK would need safeguards to protect their rights and interests. Now, some on the continent like to assume this is just the UK pursuing its own self-interest at the expense of the collective good. But it's the opposite. If we cannot protect the collective interests of non-Eurozone member states, then they will have to choose between joining the euro, which the UK will not do, or leaving the European Union. So we have fought to safeguard the rights of non-euro members, but it has not been easy. And let me spell out just some of the issues I've seen firsthand sitting at that ECOFIN table in the area of financial services, where it's been the most difficult. Deeper integration in the Eurozone has thrown up four sorts of challenges, and we've had to argue our case and work hard to build alliances to deal with all four of them. But again, for those who say reform isn't possible, we've been more successful in starting to deal with them than some people expected. First, there is the danger that Euro members could start to use their collective voting weight in the EU to effectively write the rules for the whole of the EU by qualified majority vote. Under the Lisbon Treaty from 2016, the Eurogroup on its own will have sufficient votes to pass any financial services legislation for the whole of the European Union. That's a problem because it could leave us in a position where Euro members, including ones with little or no financial services industry, can caucus together to impose financial services legislation on the UK, which has the world's leading financial centre. And we've already started to see the Eurogroup discussing EU directives privately before involving other member states, like they did over the Bank Recovery and Resolution Directive last July. It means there's a very real risk that badly thought through legislation will be imposed on the United Kingdom. And as the Chancellor of a country where financial services represent a tenth of the economy and employ more than 1 million people, I couldn't let that happen. Damaging Europe's great global financial centre would also, incidentally, be very bad for the whole of Europe as well. The City of London is not, as some of our continental friends kid themselves, in competition with Paris and Frankfurt. It is in competition with places like Hong Kong, Singapore, and New York. And that is why it's important that we secured some important institutional changes to protect the UK and ensure we have safe, competitive financial services. It was a long, hard fight, but we negotiated in the ECOFIN and the European Council a whole new voting system, which Andrea alluded to, the so-called double majority system, which will apply in the European Banking Authority. Double majority voting means that legal proposals now require a majority of both Eurozone and non-Eurozone countries to pass. And people said we would not be able to secure a new voting system, that it was impossible. But we did. That leads me to the second challenge. We've had problems with discriminatory treatment of non-Eurozone member states. A clear example is the European Central Bank's policy of forcing clearinghouses with large euro-based transactions to move to the Eurozone. How can we say there is an EU-wide single market if we say that certain businesses can only locate in certain member states? And that's why we're taking the European Central Bank to the European Court of Justice. And that's why, alongside double majority voting, we fought hard for and secured a new binding legal provision in the single supervision mechanism regulations to prevent discrimination against financial service providers based on their location within the EU. Third, we've had problems with accountability and transparency and basic policy discipline in some European institutions. The Commission's legislative proposal on the financial transaction tax, for example, was contradicted by its own original impact assessment, which showed that the policy would reduce EU GDP. And then there's the European rules on bonuses, with their damaging consequences and perverse incentives for the big salary rises we're already starting to see. To establish the right principles, we've been taking an increasing number of cases to the European Court of Justice, which is not something we do lightly. We're going to court over the financial transaction tax, the bonus cap, and short selling, as well as the action I mentioned against the ECB on clearinghouses. Far from being unthinkingly anti-European, we are using the European Court to enforce European principles of non-discrimination and adherence to European law. And we have a good argument in all these cases, and the ECJ's Advocate General and the Council's legal services have on separate occasions both agreed with key UK arguments, and we of course await those final judgments. And lastly, on the whole issue of ins versus outs, we inherited a situation where the previous government accepted that the UK and other non-Euro member states would be liable for contributing to the costs of Eurozone bailouts. That was completely unacceptable. So another principle this government has established, thanks to the very hard negotiating of the Prime Minister, is that the UK and other non-Euro members will not pay for European bailouts alongside the new European Stability Mechanism. We've also established that those member states outside the banking union will not pay for bailing out banks in that banking union as part of the new Single Resolution Mechanism. After all, one of the reasons we didn't join the euro is because we didn't want to take on this kind of fiscal responsibility for other member states. Now, I've been clear since the start of the process that Eurozone integration was necessary to make the euro work, but it would throw up these issues, and that in return we would expect to see the rights of non-euro members protected. That has been the consistent position that the Prime Minister and I have maintained for 3 years now. But it is not the case that the UK is always the member state arguing for less activity or blocking things. We've led the way on financial services regulation and ring-fencing our banks. We have the most stringent capital and liquidity rules in Europe. Nor are we sitting on the sidelines. We've been active in fighting our corner, building alliances, winning arguments in Brussels. For example, we ensured that the so-called hedge fund directive protected the single market with passporting rights for EU players that meet the rules. This was against opposition from others who wanted to keep markets closed. We're fighting now for the opening up of the derivatives market to bring competition and better value to European customers. We've achieved a lot. We are achieving more, but this isn't enough. And what is becoming clearer as the Eurozone integration increases is that we are now at a point where we are stretching the EU institutional architecture to its limits. We risk going beyond what is legally possible or politically sustainable. The European treaties are not fit for purpose. They didn't anticipate a European Union where some countries would pursue dramatically deeper integration than others. Rather than face up to the truth, those in Brussels are being forced into legal gymnastics as they try to stretch the existing treaties to fit a situation they were not designed for. A classic example before us at the moment is the banking union's Single Resolution Mechanism. Because the rules weren't designed to support a banking bailout fund for just some EU members, those member states taking part have had to create a hastily put together intergovernmental treaty completely outside the European Union. We don't want this to be a source of legal disputes later on. The euro has to be put on firmer foundations. For the crisis in the Eurozone may have abated, but the contradictions it revealed are not yet resolved. And we should use this moment of relative tranquility in the markets to build those foundations for the future. And that's why the questions thrown up by the Eurozone integration are inevitably linked to the wider reform negotiations that I touched on at the start. Ultimately, I don't think we will be able to maintain this approach of patching things up as we go along with contorted legal innovations and short-term fixes. We are taking a great risk with the future economic security of Europe if we do so. Instead of make, do, and mend, we should make the treaties fit for purpose. We're not the first to recognise this. The new German coalition agreement states that we will adapt the treaty bases of the economic and monetary union. Enrico Letta, the Prime Minister of Italy, has also talked about treaty change. And there is potential common ground here. Let me recap. Europe urgently needs economic reform. Eurozone integration is necessary if the euro is to survive. But proper legal protection for the rights of non-euro members is absolutely necessary to preserve the single market and make it possible for Britain to remain in the EU. I believe it is in no one's interest for Britain to come to face a choice between joining the euro or leaving the European Union. We don't want to join the euro, but also our withdrawal from a Europe we'd succeeded in reforming would be bad for Britain. And a country of the size and global reach of the UK leaving would be very bad for the whole of the European Union. Let us not shy away from robust democratic argument on a subject that goes to the heart of our national interest. Feelings run high on both sides of the argument, and that is understandable. But strong feeling must never be allowed to cloud clear judgment about where this country's real long-term economic interests lie. It is clear what the British people want. They refuse to accept that we just have to take the EU as it is, that one size must fit all, that change is impossible, that reform is doomed. Nor do they accept that the only course open to us is to pack up and leave, to abandon the single market and the common rules from which we benefit, and to walk away. They are rightly suspicious that the one thing that unites those who urge Britain to join the euro and those who advocate leaving the European Union is their shared conviction that any change is impossible and that there is no other way. There is another way. It is time to change the EU and to change Britain's relationship with it, and then to place the decision in the hands of the British people. Do you want to stay in a reformed Europe, or would you prefer to leave? That is our policy. That is our commitment to the British people. 13 years ago, William Hague warned of the dangers of the euro, for Europe and for Britain. And he was right, and I believe he was right too, when he said that our country wanted to be in Europe, but not run by Europe. In Europe, but not run by Europe. That's the phrase that sums it all up for me. Now we have the chance to give the British people a real choice. The biggest economic risk facing Europe doesn't come from those who want reform and renegotiation. It comes from a failure to reform and renegotiate. It is the status quo which condemns the people of Europe to an ongoing economic crisis and continuing decline. And so there is a simple choice for Europe: reform or decline. Our determination is clear: to deliver the reform and then let the people decide. And that's exactly what we will do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Chancellor, for those remarks. We now have time for a couple of questions before the Chancellor has to leave from delegates at the conference. So if anyone has any questions, now is the time. Michael.
Thank you very much indeed, Chancellor. My name is Michael Wohlgemuth. I'm the Director of Open Europe Berlin. And also thank you for your very kind words about our small but efficient organization in Berlin. And I can tell you that in Berlin and all across Europe, perhaps even now in Paris, I do notice a growing appetite for, or need for, reforms. And we all feel that. And my question would simply be, how do you plan to work with your European Union partners when it comes to increase competitiveness for the European Union as a whole, and also to secure and make sure that the single market, which is the core or the heart of the European Union, remains stable, intact, and can be further developed?
Well, the answer is we work very hard at our European relationships, and we work particularly hard at our relationship with Germany. And David Cameron spends a great deal of time talking to Angela Merkel. I spend a great deal of time talking to my German opposite number, Wolfgang Schäuble. And we're getting to know the new coalition in Germany. We also have good relationships with many others in Europe. And I think the point I was trying to make in my speech is that these alliances have actually worked quite well, often with Germany, in, for example, reducing the EU budget, getting deregulation and the cutting of red tape onto the European agenda, although I would be the first to accept we now need to see real proof in the pudding of that. I don't know if he's here, I know he's speaking at this conference, but David Lidington, I think, is the first Europe minister we've had who's been to every single EU member state. So at all levels of the government, we are working incredibly hard at these relationships. And in this, what I was trying to say towards the end of my speech is the Eurozone, and of course, Germany is the largest economy in the Eurozone. The Eurozone understands, and I think Germany understands this more than others in the Eurozone, that there needs to be treaty change to put the euro onto a firmer foundation. And you saw that with the recent debate about the single resolution mechanism, the banking bailout fund, where, as I say, they went through these extraordinary gymnastics and ended up with an intergovernmental treaty outside the EU. They know that's not a way to create a solid foundation for their currency, and they've seen the price of having unstable foundations. So I think there is a desire for treaty change there. Clearly in Britain, we want treaty change to make sure that Europe works better for its citizens, to protect the rights of non-Euros members, to make sure that Britain's interests are properly reflected. So there is a convergence there. Not everyone likes to acknowledge it, but it is happening.
Yes, Sara.
Dear Chancellor, my name is Sara Skyttedal. I am the Vice President of the Youth of the European People's Party and also the Chairman of the Swedish Young Christian Democrats. It's been a pleasure listening to your speech here today, and I fully agree with your point that economic reform is needed to tackle EU's lack of legitimacy. As you noted, we have seen historical success when reducing the EU budget. And even though Sweden and UK need to negotiate hard on this even in the future, it would be very interesting to hear you elaborate a bit on what would be the changes in priorities within the EU budget that you would like to see as well.
Well, the truth is that our overwhelming priority, and ultimately in these negotiations you have to focus on what's the main thing you want to achieve. The first thing we wanted to achieve was the reduction in the budget, and with the help of Sweden and others, we have achieved that. There is then the question of how the money is spent, which I agree is also incredibly important. And it's pretty obvious, indeed Andrea was drawing attention to it in her opening remarks, that in the modern age, for the European Union to be spending 40% or so of its budget on agriculture, important as the rural economy is just the wrong priority for Europe. And there are things we can collectively do to promote trade, as we were just hearing, to do joint scientific collaboration. A lot of big science projects actually these days are too expensive for a single country. It's exactly the kind of thing we should be working with our European colleagues on. And although we did make some progress in that direction, so actually the proportion of the budget spent on agriculture fell, or is falling rather, and the science budget went up, I don't think anyone would say, if you were starting from a clean sheet of paper, this is where the European Union should be spending its money. And there are, of course, also blatant abuses of, I would say, public money and a waste of money, for example, running to parliaments. I mean, that's clearly a total waste of money, a deal stitched together several years ago to keep some member states happy, but the people paying for it, the people in this room, in other words, the citizens of Europe. So there are clearly savings you can make in the budget, there are clearly different priorities, but I will be straight with you that the first priority was to get the budget falling. Now we need to make sure it's going to the right place.
Thank you. I think I have time for one final question. Yes, Maria.
My name is Maria Borelius, and I am a Swedish businesswoman and writer working here from London. Two Swedes posing question here, it seems. Thank you for your speech. I thought it was hugely refreshing to have an EU speech that actually begins with jobs, science, innovation, and youth unemployment rather than legalities. And on that note, the small and medium-sized businesses like mine being at the core of job creation in the EU, what practical steps do you see being taken to facilitate for smaller and medium-sized businesses in the future? Yeah. What actual steps are needed now to facilitate this boost in jobs and science and innovation that you're talking about?
Well, we undertook an exercise here where we got together some of Britain's business leaders and people who ran small companies as well as large companies, asked them what were the European regulations that were most hindering their ability to expand, take people on, and export to the rest of the world. And we took those ideas David Cameron took those ideas to other European leaders, including the Prime Minister of Sweden, and the German Chancellor and others, the Dutch Prime Minister, and we've secured agreement amongst those member states and actually the support of the European Parliament to pursue some of these issues. And I'll give you an example of where we've actually made some progress. I'll come on to where much needs to be done. But for example, clinical trials for medicines have become easier in Europe because of changes we've made at the European Union level. There was a danger that the regulations we were putting around clinical trials would just mean that Britain, Sweden and the rest of Europe weren't going to be at the forefront of medical advance anymore. We've made those changes. Another example is, for example, the Posted Workers Directive, which I think would have threatened jobs in this, and we've dealt with that. We hear in the last few days, shale gas is another area where there was a risk, and I wouldn't say this risk has entirely gone away, but there was a risk of EU rules that we would just simply take Europe out of an energy revolution, which is dramatically cutting energy prices in the United States, as people often see and read, but also actually in China and many other countries. So that would have been, I think, a catastrophe for Europe if that had been the case. We would literally be pricing ourselves out of the world economy. But the signs are positive in that space. I would say there are some other things. I mean, I don't know the exact nature of your business, and it tends to be quite sectoral. But, for example, the REACH directive on chemicals is threatening to put a lot of smaller manufacturing businesses in Europe out of business or impose a very costly burden on them. I think more could be done on open data. So much of business now is on the internet, and e-commerce is so important, yet we don't have a digital single market. Many small businesses now can start up using the internet, and reduces enormously the costs of the sort of barriers to entry. And then finally, there's the social and employment law, where I just think that's so burdensome on the smaller businesses. So there's a big agenda out there. I mean, ultimately, there's not a finance minister in Europe, there's not a single one of my colleagues sitting around the ECOFIN table who is not focused on what they can do to increase the growth of their economy and create jobs. So we've all got the same end goal. What we've got to agree on is the means to get there. And what I see is a growing agreement on what that route is. We just got to have the courage to go ahead and take that route.
Thank you very much. I think that's all we have time for. As you can imagine, the Chancellor has an extremely busy schedule. I apologise. Do we have?
I see Nick. If I don't take a question from Nick Robinson.
Oh, okay. So yeah, and also that will allow it to be.
I will get 6 months of pay. Yeah. So
Nick Robinson, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick Robinson, BBC News. Would you forgive me doing two, because you're here to talk about Europe, but there's another issue. Just briefly on Europe. Is not your party's threat of civil war on the issue of Europe almost a guarantee, as the head of Open Europe has said, that you will not get your way in any negotiations? But on the issue of the day, if I could, on bankers' bonuses, do you accept that as Chancellor you ought to say no to the idea of RBS giving their bankers double the bonus that they get in salary?
Well, let me take the two questions, although they are linked, because European rules relate to the second point. First of all, the Conservative Party is addressing one of the biggest issues facing this country. And I think we are doing it actually in a pretty civilized way, and we're having a grown-up conversation. We're here at a meeting in part organised by Andrew and the Fresh Start group, and I can see many of my colleagues in the front rows here. And I think it's good that a political party is having this debate with the country about Britain's future relationship with the European Union, and even more importantly, how we're going to create a future for our young people and give them jobs and opportunities. So, I would rather be in a party that is addressing the issues of the future than a party that has stuck its head in the sand and is refusing to address these things. And the only conversation that happens on Europe is one between the leader of the party and the shadow chancellor, where apparently they don't agree. So, that's I think a sign of a healthy democracy. And the second, it relates to this. Look, this government has done more than any to bring the banking system back under control, to regulate banking properly, to ring-fence our retail banks, to make sure the bankers are properly accountable, and if things go wrong, the money they were given is taken off them. These European rules will not lead to bankers being paid less. What it will lead to is a Fred Goodwin-style situation where you will not be able to get the money back off the bankers when things go wrong. That is precisely what we've been trying to move away from in Britain, and that's what we're going to do.
Sarah, thank you very much. Thank you, Chancellor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.